I'm Mark Crewman. I am the director of the Center for the Study of Citizenship and a professor of history here at Wayne State University. I want to welcome you here to help the center fulfill its mission, which is to build a community of knowledgeable, active citizens. The center, at the heart of the center's fundamental values is the belief that communities are built by such people of varying ages here and of different partisan beliefs and different political beliefs. The center's work is one promoting research and education about citizenship. In addition to our Citizen Dialogue series, we have projects advancing civic engagement more generally on campus and in the public schools. Also, projects on citizenship for health. So if there are any physicians in the audience, you might want to pay attention to that, David. Also, important project for those of you who are in business school here, in our corporate citizenship project, advancing corporate citizenship among small and medium-sized businesses. The center's work is exciting and engaging. I urge you to use the information on the program to reach out to us, to check out our brand new newsletter, which I have one copy. We've done a major run, so but they're already sold out. So I recommend that you get your copy online at the center's website. Our editor, PhD student in political science, Jason Lawrence, is with us tonight. I want to thank him for his great work on our website and for his terrific work on the newsletter. I hope that those of you who are engaged this evening will seek out other opportunities to reach out to us. If you have ideas about future uncontroversial issues like tonight's topic, I would welcome your advice. You can reach me at citizenship@wayne.edu or at my personal Wayne email address, m.crewman@wayne.edu. But please, if you have ideas, you have any thoughts about how to improve this program, please contact us. We want to learn, we want to get better. Tonight, the center holds not its first civic dialogue. That began in 2006 with a debate about same-sex marriage in which my colleague John Corvino was a participant, and in 2011 we reprised we gave John a stronger but not strong enough opponent in the debate in 2011. But in those conversations before hundreds of people, they demonstrated the value of civil, thoughtful discussion of difficult issues. I was going to talk about the decline in public discourse by way of introduction, but we all bemoan the decline in civic discourse. So I don't really have to review it, but we do know that this is a world politically polarized. Our political community, which we tend not to think of any longer as a community, but as very distinct communities that don't talk to one another about difficult issues. And you especially don't talk with your friends about it because they might have a different point of view than you, and you don't want to get into an argument with them. Or you end up only having friends who agree with you. We certainly tend to gravitate into those kinds of social and political circles. We have, though, what the conservative columnist David Brooks calls an obligation to our fellow citizens, including those who disagree with us. We have an obligation to care for them. And his liberal colleague, Nicholas Kristof, argued as vigorously for multiple voices on college campuses, that we have obligations to listen to one another, to talk to one another, and I was inspired to revive our project of dialogue by our moderator, Brian Dickerson's column in the Free Press in the late spring. I still think of early June as summer, but there's a professor for you, where Brian talked about the impoverishment of public discourse, about how we talked past one another instead of to one another. And the consequence of this is a world where we don't listen, we talk. Tonight is as much about listening as speaking. We've made a big deal about the norms of the evening. We intend to mix you up for the discussion so that people on different sides of these issues are talking to one another rather than among themselves. This is an exercise in conversation in an effort to find common ground. Try to understand what others say before you seek to be understood yourself. An opportunity for one person at a time to talk, but only talk for a limited amount of time. There will be facilitators at each table who will be following a protocol. So please follow that. This is an extraordinary opportunity. I want to thank our speakers for being here, Jim Mikowski and Linda Brundage, because they were open to the conversation with one another about an issue that, that we almost uniformly have strong personal and political feelings about. So I want to welcome you. I want to thank Brian Dickerson for his willingness to moderate. I want to thank Amay Moran, the center's staff member, for prodding the project forward and identifying our speakers tonight. And I want to thank all of you for coming. Now it's my pleasure to hand this over to Brian Dickerson.
I'm Brian Dickerson. I'm a columnist at the Detroit Free Press for longer than I'd care to be specific about right now, and a member of the Free Press editorial board. And it's my privilege tonight to host these two extremely well-informed people who have come to talk to you about a very fractious issue. I'm going to introduce them, talk for just a few moments about what we're hoping to accomplish tonight and get right to it. Dr. Linda Brundage is a mother, a grandmother, and a licensed psychologist in Michigan. She's made quite the tour of Michigan educational facilities. She's been educated at Alma College, Central Michigan University, Western Michigan University, and she completed her clinical internship at Michigan State University, and has been in East Lansing, as I understand it, ever since. Her professional experience includes private practice, treating individuals and families, and also working with violent offenders, including sex offenders in the Michigan prison system, where she worked as the chief psychologist in a treatment unit for Michigan inmates suffering from chronic mental illness for many years. Linda joined the gun violence prevention movement in January 2013, which I recall is a month after the shooting at Sandy Hook in New Jersey. She was a founding member of the Michigan branch of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, and is more recently the executive director of the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. As part of her gun violence prevention work, she has testified in Washington and been a keynote speaker at several gun violence events. Linda, welcome. Thanks very much for being here tonight. Mr. Jim Makowski is a longtime trial lawyer with an expertise in criminal defense and legal issues related to firearms in Michigan. He began his career practicing for one of the top criminal defense firms in the state and opened his own office specializing in criminal defense and civil litigation in 2006. He's a graduate of the University of Michigan Dearborn and got his law degree at the University of Detroit Mercy Law School in 1999. Mr. Makowski serves as corporation counsel for Michigan Gun Owners, Inc., and as legal advisor to Michigan Open Carry, Inc. He's a frequent guest on media shows in Metro Detroit and a well-regarded speaker on legal issues relating to firearms. Thank you, Jim, very much for being with us tonight. We're here to debate and argue a little bit, but mostly we're here to learn from each other and to listen, hopefully with fresh ears, to the arguments advanced by gun owners and those who favor greater restrictions on gun ownership. Dr. Brundage, Mr. Makowski, and I assume everybody in this room shares the desire to live in a secure community where every law-abiding citizen is safe and everyone's rights are respected. What we'll talk about tonight is how to get there and the very different policies that gun owners and gun control advocates believe would help us achieve that shared vision. My role tonight is simply to surface the most important issues and make sure both panelists have the greatest possible opportunity to answer them. Toward that end, I talked to both Mr. Makowski and Dr. Brundage in advance of the evening. We talked about what we wanted to cover, the kind of questions I wanted to ask. I'm not here to ambush anybody. It's not an exam in extemporaneous speaking. I just want as full and frank an airing of the issues as possible. To avoid, this is not my first Second Amendment rodeo, and to avoid getting bogged down in issues about original intent and what the framers meant 2 centuries plus ago when they sat down and constructed the Second Amendment, I thought we would begin tonight by asking each of our panelists to talk about whether they think there's a continuing rationale for a constitutional right to bear arms. If we were drafting the Second Amendment in 2016, I asked them both to think about what would it look like? What would our concerns be? After that, we're going to discuss 3 broad approaches to the regulation of firearms and talk about which, if any of them, offer a practical way to reduce gun violence. We'll begin with a short opening statement, 2 minutes, by Dr. Brundage, then go to Mr. Mikowski, and then I'll open the first question.
Well, I certainly appreciate being part of this important event. So I want to thank Wayne State University and especially thank the Center.
There is virtually no one on the first try who's ever said Center for the Study of Citizenship right. So it's okay. You're in good, excellent company.
And I practiced.
Even better company then.
Yeah. I'm currently the executive director of the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. And our mission statement is, we are a grassroots organization working toward the prevention of gun violence through community education and stronger gun laws. I want to contextualize for you the work that we are trying to do here tonight. Too often, these discussions are filled with numbers and statistics. You know, 30,000 plus deaths a year from guns, 22,000 secondary to suicide by gun, 8 children every day, and so on and on. If all we know are the numbers, it's much too easy to turn away. And really, aren't statistics numbers with the tears washed off? I want us to consider what we're really talking about tonight. My friend Sandy Anglin Phillips lost her daughter at the Aurora theater shooting. And she wrote these words 3 years after the death of her daughter Jessie, when she was finally able to view the autopsy of her child. Quote, "I knew, of course, about the 6 gunshot wounds that killed her, about the armor-piercing bullet that slammed into her head, but I did not know the details. My husband and I didn't look at the photographs. We looked at a diagram of what was done to my beautiful daughter's tiny body. Her right leg was ripped apart and rammed into her left leg. Her abdomen received 4 bullets and additional fragments. Fragments were lodged in her right wrist and other places. Her left clavicle was broken by a bullet. In her head, a bullet left a 5-inch hole. The bullet entered through her left eye, ripping apart her brain." Unquote. I read a bit of Sandy's story to try and humanize what we're talking about, and I think it communicates some of the pain of gun violence.
Thank you very much. Mr. Majowski.
Thank you for inviting me today. It's my pleasure to speak here. I'm the corporate counsel for Michigan Gun Owners Incorporated. Michigan Gun Owners Incorporated is a not-for-profit grassroots organization that is dedicated to preserving the Second Amendment and Article 1, Section 6 of the Michigan Constitution, and ensuring the right to keep and bear arms, and to encourage and educate the public on safe gun ownership. I, too, am against gun violence. I don't want to see any innocent lives lost to gun violence. However, our approach to solving the issue of gun violence, if you want to call it an issue, is radically different. The laws that are on the books are far more restrictive than they need be already, but we need to enforce the existing gun laws. There's no need to create more gun laws to further restrict the lawful citizens from owning firearms. We need to enforce the laws we have, and we need to get mental health treatment for the people who need the mental health treatment. But the bottom line is no laws that are passed are going to stop gun violence. It's quite simple. You can pass as many laws as you want, and those will only restrict the rights of law-abiding citizens. Adam Lanza was the Sandy Hook shooter. Everyone decried the fact that he had an assault rifle, quote unquote, a semi-automatic rifle, and went and shot up those school kids. And that was an awful tragedy. But what the media fails to report is the fact that he killed his own mother to get that gun. It was an illegally obtained firearm. So a criminal is going to get a gun no matter how much we try to restrict it legally. So the only answer is to have the right to defend yourself, have the ability to defend yourself. Dr. Brundage pointed out, was talking about the Aurora, Colorado shooting at the movie theater. It's important to note that that movie theater banned private possession of a firearm. There was nobody in that movie theater who had the legal ability to defend themselves at that time. Had there been someone armed, a citizen armed, they could have perhaps prevented or at least limited that tragedy. But when the firearms were removed from that environment, it just created a free fire zone for the shooter.
Thank you, Mr. Machowski. Makowski. Yeah, in my feeble defense, there is another attorney, Jim Majowski, who ran for Congress last year, and I apologize. I will do that more than once tonight, I fear.
It's okay.
Mr. Makowski, I'd like to begin the first of our 4 segments with you. It's 2016. We live in a country where approximately 55 million Americans own approximately 265 million guns. Why should the law recognize in 2016 a fundamental right to own firearms?
I think it's a practical issue. The police, since the 1970s, there was a Supreme Court decision that said that the police are not there to protect you. There was a lawsuit filed, I can't remember what year, and I can't remember the case site, but there was a lawsuit filed against a police department where they wouldn't respond to a violent crime. There was a 911 call, and they were sued, and the response, the Supreme Court ruled that the police are not there to protect you, which we all know is true. The police are only there to investigate a crime afterwards. You have no ability to defend yourself unless you are armed. A firearm is the most effective way to defend yourself. If you eliminate firearms, you eliminate the ability to defend yourself. There's 55 million Americans who have legal possession of firearms. I have no idea how many illegal firearms are owned by criminals, but the law-abiding citizens who are lawfully possessing weapons and using them in self-defense, disarming them is not going to disarm a criminal. That's not going to do anything to prevent gun violence. It's just going to make more victims for potential criminal activity. If you eliminate every gun in private hands in the country, what you're saying is you're going to get law-abiding citizens to turn in their firearms. Criminals aren't going to turn in their firearms. Why would they? That's just absurd. Even if they were to turn in all of their firearms, even if you get every firearm out of private hands, out of law-abiding citizens' hands and criminals' hands, you're still going to have violence, and you've taken away the ability of the weak to be able to protect themselves. You know, when I hear people say, well, let's get rid of all the guns. Okay, why do you hate older people and infirm people? Because what you're saying is you are taking that person's ability to defend themselves away from them. I might be able to physically defend myself. How is my 75-year-old mother-in-law going to defend herself if she gets into a self-defense situation? She won't be able to. The only way she can defend herself is with a firearm, because you can't count on the police to be able to respond. I grew up in Southwest Detroit. I grew up 4 miles from here. I experienced gun violence at an early age. I saw it all the time, and I saw the effects of gun violence. I had to call the police on several occasions. Detroit police, you were lucky to get a car out there in 45 minutes. What's going to happen to you if someone's breaking in your door? You're going to wait 45 minutes for a police response? You can't. You will be a victim of that crime.
Thank you. I'm going to give Dr. Brundage a chance. Should we have a fundamental right to purchase and own firearms in 2016?
Well, that is the law.
Okay.
And I want to be really clear at this point. There's not a gun violence prevention group in the nation that's coming after guns. I don't think I said it, and certainly the coalition doesn't take that position. We understand that the Second Amendment exists. However, Justice Scalia, in his opinion 85 years ago, something like that, in Heller, he held that the right to bear arms is not absolute. So if I were writing the Second Amendment today, I would say, okay, let's allow people to have guns. Let's allow hunting. Let's allow sports shooting. And let's allow the defense of one's home, in the home. So I think maybe we could agree on that point. Where we might have divergent opinions is I don't think I need to walk into Myers to buy a loaf of bread and a quart of milk carrying a gun. It's simply not necessary. And I think we really need to call out the NRA and the gun industry for developing the climate of fear that sells guns. We were talking earlier about the number of guns in the country. 3%, let me get this right, 3% of the population own 50% of the guns, which means everybody that owns a gun likely owns several. And there are super gun owners out there with 40 or more guns. So I think part of my amendment to my amendment would be we really don't need for individual citizens to have 40 plus guns. Maybe collectors of the antique muskets that were in style when the Second Amendment was first written. But I think the important takeaway that I would like you to have is, yes, we do have the Second Amendment, and no, it is not absolute, and maybe we can find some common ground about that point of it not being absolute.
Mr. Majowski, if I heard her correctly, Dr. Brundage is willing to concede you a Second Amendment for sportsmen, for people who want to protect their homes, for hunters, sport shooting. Why else do people need to carry firearms?
Well, I personally think that you're more exposed to danger outside of your house. That's where you're going to encounter people. It's clear that you have a right to protect yourself in your home, and I thank her for her generosity for allowing me to keep my gun in my house. But I think that we all know that violence happens everywhere these days, and I don't think that that is overly, perhaps the media does sensationalize it, your colleagues, but there's still a problem. We have carjackings, we have any number of crimes that take place outside the home. You're more likely to be need a gun when you're outside the home than you are when you're within the home. And I'd like to address the issue of the supered collector. If we're to believe Dr. Brundage, it's okay to own, say, 39 guns, but that 40th gun is going to turn you into a psychotic killer. That's absurd too. The idea of how many firearms that you're going to own, I don't know how that's relevant. If you're a law-abiding citizen, it doesn't matter if you own one. It doesn't matter if you own 100. You're either obeying the law or you're not obeying the law, and you're using the gun criminally or not.
Is there any number that is unreasonable?
However many you can afford. My wife would say as many as I have right now, and maybe less. But
so if I wanted to buy enough guns to equip my own army,
if you can afford it, there's no reason, as long as you're not going to break the law, why should we restrict that? Again, if the gun is a tool, why would you restrict the ownership of that tool? Why would 900 guns be acceptable? 901 turn you into a dangerous psychotic person. There's no reason to restrict the number of guns that are owned. That's absurd. There's no logical basis for that.
Dr. Brundage, I read the same story you did just a few weeks ago about a relatively small percentage of gun owners owning most of the guns. Is there any data that suggests that people who own more guns are more likely to commit, to use them unlawfully, to commit violence with them?
I'm not aware of a study like that, Brian. What we do know is that in terms of where gun violence happens, both in terms of homicide or suicide, that happens more readily in states with lower, less effective gun laws. So the better the gun laws in a particular state, like Massachusetts, the lower the rate of both homicide and suicide is. But I don't have a number for your specific question.
3,000 people or plus have been shot in the city of Chicago in 2016. Chicago has some of the most restrictive gun laws in the country. I don't know how you can draw a correlation to more restrictive gun laws reduce homicides. There's no correlation there.
But there are some really good studies that correlate gun laws in a particular state with incidences of both homicide and suicide. Chicago is an interesting and unusual and difficult problem. When the police pick up guns from a crime, they find that something like 96% of those guns are trafficked up. Indiana provides a lot of guns to the city of Chicago. I was recently just able to shut down a bad apple gun dealer that was just north of Chicago. So the guns don't originate in Chicago, and Mr. Mikowski is absolutely right. Chicago does have stringent gun laws. So a solution to the Chicago problem would be to have national laws against trafficking. You know, you can go into Indiana, go to a gun store, load up your trunk with guns and ammunition, drive into Chicago, open your trunk in the corner in a McDonald's parking lot, and sell those guns out of your car.
Except it's been a felony since 1968.
All right.
I missed that.
Look,
It's been a felony since 1968.
to a felony
To go to cross a state border to buy firearms and to bring them back across the state border to another state border to sell them has been a felony on the books since the Gun Control Act of 1968. So we're talking illegally obtained and illegally sold firearms.
Right.
Again, nothing to do with legal gun owners. Nothing.
Although you could buy them legally in another state and legally transport them into a state or a city that had
Under the Gun
stringent
Control
gun control
Act of
law.
1968, it is illegal for you to go to another state and acquire a firearm. The only way you can do so is to go through a federal firearms license dealer.
Right.
But to go to
Right.
like the quote-unquote gun show loophole, to go over to Indiana, to buy firearms in another state and to transport them to Chicago is a federal felony. It's a 10-year felony. It's been a 10-year felony since 1968, the Gun Control Act.
Okay. Let's move on to the second topic right now. Broadly speaking, there are three ways in which champions of gun control have sought to regulate the sale and use of firearms. And I'd like in this second segment to look at attempts to restrict who can buy or carry a gun. In the next two, we'll look at restrictions on what kind of gun they can buy, and finally, where and under what circumstances they can carry firearms. This time I'll start with Dr. Brundage. Who, in your judgment, should not be allowed to purchase a handgun?
Someone with a felony history,
Okay.
someone who is adjudicated mentally ill. And that word adjudicated is really important for this discussion. It's a legal term. So it takes it out of the mental health system, although psychologists and psychiatrists would provide information to the courts. The key point there is adjudicated, and domestic violence perpetrators. I would hope we could all agree that those three categories of persons ought not to have guns, and those are the three.
Let me interrupt you for just a moment to see if Mr. Mikowski is on board so far.
Actually, I'm a little bit more restrictive than that.
Okay, well, we'll keep going. We've eliminated people who have been adjudicated mentally ill, or I assume adjudicated incompetent.
Yeah.
We've
That's the adjudication question is,
right. We've eliminated people with violent criminal records.
felonies.
Okay.
Felonies.
Would we agree that there should be some age restriction?
Well, certainly.
We would certainly. Neither of you would want to make guns available to somebody under 9 years old, right?
Under 21.
Oh, okay. No, I'm just. Tell me what the floor is. I'm just trying to find a.
With unsupervised, absolutely.
Okay.
I think it's amusing because I've got an 8-year-old who has her own .22 rifle, but she only gets it when she's under daddy's supervision.
Okay.
But yes, I agree with it.
Okay.
That's under supervision, no, you're right. I would say 18, right now, it's illegal to purchase a firearm from a federal firearms license dealer. Anyone under 21 cannot purchase it. I think their age should be 18. I think it's silly that we can send people off toward age 18. They can't legally own a firearm until they turn 21. I think that's absurd. So I think 18 is a reasonable cutoff. And
Live with that.
and to, if I may address one of the points she said, Dr. Brundage made stressed the fact that someone who's adjudicated mentally ill, I don't think you need to have adjudicated. See, everything that Dr. Brundage has stated is already illegal. It is already illegal for a felon to own a firearm. It is already illegal for someone with a domestic violence conviction to own a firearm. It's already illegal for someone who has been not only adjudicated mentally ill, but who has a mental illness to purchase a firearm. All those people are already restricted classes. Those are laws that have already been on the books. The domestic violence statute went on the books in 1995. The rest of those restrictions were on the books since 1968. We need to enforce those laws.
Okay, well, let's talk about that, because there seems to be some consensus between you here that there should be some restriction by age, some restriction by legal or medical status. We haven't talked about training, but I can tell you that I could not properly load and fire a handgun right now myself. Should I be able to go out and buy one tonight, or should I have to prove that I have a certain level of proficiency?
I think you would be a responsible person if you went out and got training. And if you ever want to get trained, I'll be happy to train you myself. But I think that in terms of restricting your right, a fundamental right to self-defense to someone who has not had training, I think that's wrong. I think you, as a responsible person, you should get training, but I don't think you should be legally restricted.
But we don't leave that judgment to drivers. We don't let anybody who wants...
The right to drive a car is not a fundamentally protected right under the Constitution.
Okay, but why is it in the public interest to let somebody who doesn't know how to use a handgun safely?
I think a responsible firearms owner would learn how to use a firearm responsibly, but I don't think that should be a legal restriction.
Why not? If that's what a responsible individual does, then why isn't it responsible for the government to demand that?
Because, again, it's a fundamental right that's enshrined in the Constitution. That is a constitutional right. It's just as important as your right to freedom of the press, Brian.
Okay. Before we leave this area, and I want to watch our time, I want to address one nettlesome issue that has come up in this presidential campaign, and that's people who are on the no-fly list. Now, we know, does everybody know what the no-fly list is? Maintained by the government to keep certain people off airplanes. Now, we know there have been people on that list who should never have been on that list in the first place. A lot of gun owners argue that because of that, because it's an imperfect instrument, and because gun ownership is a fundamental constitutional right, we shouldn't use that imperfect tool to bar somebody from purchasing a gun. But I want to direct this to you, Mr. Makowski. Isn't the proper remedy for that to give somebody who's on the no-fly list for unjust reasons the right to appeal that?
Absolutely, and I agree with that. If you're on the no-fly list for a legitimate reason, then I do think your Second Amendment rights should be restricted. However, getting on that list, it's a mystery how people make it on that list, and it's nearly impossible to get off that list. If you have a set criteria to be put on the list, if you have a established criteria to be removed from that list, and in a speedy process, with due process, then absolutely, I have no problem with that as it stands. However, the no-fly list as it stands right now, it's riddled with errors. There's no good. It's a mystery who's on it. It's a mystery how you get on it, and it's a mystery how you get off of it. If you regulate that, if you establish something where there's clear guidelines, I have no problem with that. I think that's a reasonable restriction. But give people due process. Right now, there's no due process.
Let's move on to topic 3, the second broad category of restricting the use of firearms, assuming that that you've agreed there is a group of Americans who are legally entitled to own firearms. Are there any sorts of firearms that they should be forbidden to acquire? I'll start with, who did I start with last time?
Me. You started with me last
Okay. Dr. Brundage.
Yes, anything that we would ordinarily think of as a weapon of war, there's no reason for anybody to be walking around the streets with an AK-47 or AR-15. It's simply not necessary. And during that period of time, when there was an assault ban, that worked reasonably well. During that period of time, the industry who produced, particularly the AK-15, geared up to repurpose or resell that as a shooting sports gun. I suggest that if you need an AK-15 to go deer hunting or pheasant hunting, target practice would be in order. So I think that would be one significant limitation that we would like to see, would be an assault weapons ban.
Mr. Makowski, I'm guessing you're not on board with that. But before I ask you why that, I want to ask, is there any class of weapons that you would concede should not be available to private citizens in the United States?
When you say class of weapons, are we talking about firearms, or are we talking something beyond a firearm? I can't see any good, valid reason to keep a law-abiding citizen from owning any firearm that's being made.
Okay.
That includes a machine gun.
So we're eliminating, say, shoulder-launched anti-aircraft
I don't need
missiles.
an
That's not a firearm.
anti-tank missile personally.
Right.
That does not necessarily fit into my requirements for self-defense. However, I don't see any real valid reason to prevent a law-abiding citizen from owning these guns. Up until 1985, you could purchase a machine gun all the time.
Is there a legal purpose for a law-abiding citizen to fire a surface-to-air missile?
No, there isn't. I was being a bit facetious, Brian.
All right.
I hope you realize that. Up until 1985, you could purchase a machine gun. You had to pay a $200 tax stamp to the federal government, and you could go through an application process to make that purchase. In 1985, there was a law restricting the manufacture for new machine guns to private citizens. You can still purchase one, but the price is ridiculous. But again, that was a solution looking for a problem. You know, the number of machine guns that have been used criminally in the last 30 years, I think there was 2 of them, and those were both by police officers, coincidentally.
What about high-capacity magazines? Isn't there a correlation between the capacity of magazines and the lethality of some of the incidents
I
that
think
we've
that
read about?
if I have 5 30-round magazines versus 15 10-round magazines, it's the net same effect. I think that
Well, I'm not a firearms expert, but is that true? I mean, you have to change magazines.
essentially, you have to change
right?
magazines, but
Right.
if you've got a trained shooter, they can change a magazine out in 2 seconds. The idea is not how many rounds are in the magazine. The idea is keeping the gun itself out of people's hands who don't belong owning that firearm. Restricting the magazine capacity, that's just a bandage. That's not addressing the real problem. The real problem is keeping guns out of the hands of criminals or people with mental illnesses. Therein lies the issue.
Dr. Brundage, is there any data to support the argument that restricting things like magazine capacity, whether a gun is automatic or not, the kind of ammunition it fires, is there any data to support the argument that those are effective ways to reduce gun violence?
Well, I think anybody from Orlando would say yes. Anybody from San Bernardino would say yes. Anybody who lost loved ones in Aurora would say yes. I mean, there are many examples that we could point to where these high-capacity guns were used. This is going to surprise some people, but I went to a gun training thing 2 weeks ago, and the important thing that I learned about an assault weapon is you don't have to bring it to your shoulder and shoot it and aim it. You can just bring it up and spew, right? That's how it works. Just bring it up under your arm, and you don't have to aim. You don't have to be good at it, but you can kill many people. For instance, the 50 people that we lost in Orlando. I just don't see a point in citizens owning that kind of a weapon. I mean, it is a weapon of war. It was originally produced to be used in war situations. So what really do we need those for? And I want to make another point in response to something that Jim said, and that is we already have background checks on the books. That's true if you purchase from a federally licensed dealer. That's not true for private sales. It's not true for private sales, whether or not it's a gun show loophole, or if I've got a gun in my car and you've got $500 and I say, meet me in the parking lot and you give me the money, I'll give you the gun. That's absolutely legal in the state of Michigan. I stood in front of cop cars in Lansing, and that was happening behind me. Those are private sales, and they are not regulated in Michigan. They could be. You know, there's legislation that's been introduced that would extend the permitting process that CPL holders have to go through, the background checks, the training, all of that. We could take that and apply that to long guns so that all guns in our state could have a background check. I often say, and it's true, and I fact checked this today because I don't want to make a mistake, 40% of guns sold in the United States are sold without background check. Since we got the Brady Bill in the late 90s, 2,500,000 people have been prevented from buying a gun because they were felons or had a mental health adjudication or were domestic violence perpetrators. Imagine perhaps the lives that could be saved if 100% of gun sales were checked. And there's huge support for that kind of effort by 90% of the population of the United States, and a specific EPIC MRA poll was done here in Michigan.
Excuse me, let me see if I can get Mr. Mikowski on board with that. And if not, why not? Why not the same rules for licensed dealers and private sellers?
First of all, I love the fact that we're getting numbers thrown out, wild numbers without any basis. 90% of the people are in favor of that. I'd like to see that study. I'd like to see some support for those numbers.
Okay,
With regard to private
but
firearms,
let's stipulate that some guns are sold by licensed dealers and some guns are sold privately.
I
So
will
what's
agree
the
with that.
case for
And in
dealing with
Michigan,
it
it is
differently?
illegal to do a pistol transfer that doesn't go through a background check process of some sort. You can buy a long gun or a long gun, a rifle, or a shotgun without a background check from a private individual. Absolutely. Guess what? In most of this country, that's the case. Michigan has some of the most restrictive gun laws in the country, believe it or not. They are, believe me. Example, if you carry a firearm in your car in Michigan, throw a pistol in your glove box, you're committing a 5-year felony. California, we think California has some of the worst gun laws in the country. That's a misdemeanor in California. Okay, Michigan has some of the toughest gun laws out there. With regard to universal background checks, what that is equating to is universal firearm registration. What she's asking for is for all firearms to be registered. And registration has historically been the first step towards confiscation. How else are you going to do a background check if you don't know who owns the firearms? It's a natural result of what happens when you do universal background checks.
Back up, where has registration led to confiscation?
Nazi Germany. That was in Imperial Russia. It's in California it's happened. He's right. Registration inevitably leads to confiscation at some point when the political regimes can change. Are we looking at Nazi Germany here? Hopefully not. Do we know what the future is? I don't know what the future is going to hold for our country, but there's no good reason to register firearms. Now, when you make a purchase of a firearm, you go through a background check. If you don't go through a background,
depending on where you buy
if you purchase it from a dealer. If it's an individual sale, then if you sell it to a felon, you're committing a felony. The person who's buying it, if they're not allowed to do it, they're committing a felony. How much more responsibility are you going to put on people? You're going to put additional restrictions on, and you're going to lead to the universal registration.
Okay.
I'm proposed law in Michigan that would take the CPL process and apply it to the process of buying
The
a
CPL process is the
Concealed pistol
Concealed-
license.
concealed
pistol license, okay.
specifically says this cannot lead to registration. What happens is those records are destroyed, and the only place that there's a record of them are in the gun shop, the federally licensed dealer.
Yeah.
So the law, as proposed in Michigan, precludes registration.
Okay. We need to move on to our last topic.
I
Go
got to
ahead.
address
30
that.
seconds, okay? Can you?
When the Brady Act was set up, the National Instant Criminal Background Check,
Yeah.
where you call in and you get a federal approval to get a license, approve a purchase. That the statute, the federal law says that the ATF is not allowed to compile those records. They're not allowed to keep it. You're supposed to do a background check. Okay, Jim just bought a gun. Okay, check he's okay to buy the gun. They're not supposed to keep a record. It's been proven, and they've admitted to the fact they keep those records. There is a national registry for anything that's purchased from a firearms dealer. And the federal government has been breaking the law since Brady's inception, and they've admitted to it.
Okay. We're going to move on to the last topic, and the third broad area in which people have tried to regulate handguns, and that's where and for what purpose you can carry a weapon. And whose turn is it to start? Yours,
That would be
Mr.
mine.
Mikowski? Is there anywhere you would concede that people shouldn't be able, that law-abiding people shouldn't be able to carry guns?
prisons, if they go to visit an inmate. I'll concede that.
Okay.
Well, I think that's about as far as I'll concede. A sterile area in an airport, I'll concede there too. A sterile area at the airport, behind the screening, the TSA screening. Behind that area, those are sensitive areas. I would agree with that. A lot of judges and lawyers will say courts. I don't think so, but there have been enough court shootings where it might be in my best interest to have those areas restricted. But in terms of other places, I really can't think of any place where my Second Amendment right, my right to defend myself, should be surrendered.
Why do you need a gun at the elementary school Christmas pageant? Why do you need one in church?
Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook, that's why. You don't. Why did you need a gun in elementary school? What happened at Sandy Hook? What did Adam Lanza do at an elementary school? He shot and killed 23 school children. That's why you need a firearm there.
So is your argument that gun-free zones are an invitation to gun violence?
That's exactly right.
And,
there is no good reason.
Is there any data to support that? Is there any evidence that shootings occur more often in places where guns are restricted than they do where they're...
I wish I was prepared to answer that question with statistics, but almost virtually, the last time I looked, virtually every mass shooting event has been in a location where private firearms ownership or possession has been limited. Aurora was at a theater, Sandy Hook at a school. The Orlando nightclub shooting, Florida law prevents you from having a gun inside of a nightclub. Again, if someone is looking to make a name for themselves and to go out in a blaze of glory, they're going to go to a soft target. They're going to go places where they can reasonably expect there to not be someone armed and able to defend themselves. You're not going to find that. Someone's not going to go walk into a place where they know that people are armed. Well, I guess I'll take that back. There have been people who've gone into police stations shooting. So you can't tell where they're going to go shooting. That's
police stations, military bases.
Military bases. Well, no, because personnel in military bases are disarmed. You know, you're not going to find a loaded handgun on an average soldier or loaded firearm on an average soldier in a military base. Only the military police are going to have those at the gate or on patrol.
Dr. Brundage, Mr. Makowski says gun-free zones don't work. Is he right? And if he is, what's the point of restricting the geography of gun use?
There's no research-based support for Mr. Makowski's argument. It's pretty hard for me to imagine that if for one thing, I want to address the mass shootings just for a moment. Always we begin to talk about mental health in the context of a mass shooting. And I want to be really clear that while some mass shooters might be mentally ill, that does not apply for the large majority. In fact, mentally ill people are much more likely to be victimized by violence than to perpetrate violence. So I just want to, make sure that that's out there. It's pretty hard for me to imagine that somebody is gets this impulse, and the guy at Aurora had planned and purchased tear bombs and all of that kind of stuff, that he was then like, oh, that theater, no, that theater, no. Oh, this one, oh, good. I mean, that's sort of the argument that gun advocates put forth, and there's no substantive thing behind that. There's a very good report that was put out by the Violence Prevention Center, and it's called Concealed Carry Killers. And I have that if anybody wants to have a look at it. And the fact of the matter is that concealed carry people do, in fact, commit homicides and commit suicides, commit murder-suicide. And I think so to say, well, you ought to be able to carry a gun in a public school or any of those kinds of places. I recently had an opportunity to talk with a man from the UP, where actually suicide is the big problem in the UP. But he was a teacher, and he was entertaining the question of Senate Bill 442, which, if we get it, will allow guns nearly every place. And in the faculty lounge, after school, they just sort of kicked back at the end of the day, and just like that, they thought of all the kinds of things that could go wrong if there were guns in our public schools. Can you imagine the 15-year-old adolescent grabbing the gun, the 10-year-old knowing where the teacher keeps it? All of those kinds of things, all of the kinds of things that we've heard about are going to be multiplied. They're going to be multiplied. So I guess I want to say one more thing about the point of laws. Anybody in here ever drive over 70? Anybody? No, come on, anybody? Well, shoot, then we hadn't ought to have any speed limit laws, right? And there isn't. Something Mr. Mikowski said earlier, we're not going to find a gun violence prevention law that it goes across the board and fixes all of these horrible problems. But kids are dying. Little kids are dying from guns. And it's a proliferation of guns. There are 22,000 suicides from gun every year in the United States. And the key in both child deaths and suicides is easy access, because we have these 300 million guns out there. And that's the pivotal point for child access prevention laws and suicide.
Mr. Mikowski, I want to give you a brief moment to respond if you'd like to. Otherwise, I'd like to open it up to the audience, but go ahead.
I would love to respond. I suppose if we eliminate private gun ownership, I assume the suicide problem goes away. That's absurd. Okay, if you're going to commit suicide, you're going to commit suicide.
No, Mr.
Oh, there's no other ways to commit suicide?
Well,
I'm sorry. There are. You're going to commit suicide,
I
you're gonna
suspect
commit
what she's going to point out is that people who commit suicide with guns or attempt suicide with guns succeed far more often than people who use other methods.
Again, I don't know the statistics. I'm not prepared to debate that issue. However, you still have the ability to commit suicide if you're going to take pills. You can do. There's any number of ways to commit suicide. A gun is a way to commit suicide. There's other ways. That argument fails. There is no good reason to restrict private gun ownership, and the time, place, and manner restrictions never work. Dr. Brunner said that she didn't think the Aurora, Colorado theater shooter went and said, oh, that one, they don't allow guns in there. No, they didn't allow guns in any theaters in the state of Colorado. So the fact that you have a wide open area where there's ready access to unarmed victims, that's the issue. I got a little bit confused with Dr. Brundage's statement that mentally ill people are more often the victims of gun crime. I'm not.
Of violence, period.
I'm not going to dispute that. I have no feedback on that. But I thought she was saying that mentally ill people are. They're not. It's the victims of gun violence is not the issue. The issue is who commits those
Right.
mass shootings. And I don't know if she's espousing a theory that people without mental illness are going out and causing those mass shootings.
I don't think that's what you meant.
Well, I was
Right.
trying to understand
you-
her point on that one.
Did I state that correctly?
You-
I meant to say that only a very small percentage of mass shootings may be committed by mentally ill people. The
So you
example
are
that
saying
we
that-
have gone back to several times is Aurora.
And he's not mentally ill?
He was not. The courts found that he was not mentally ill.
Okay.
That he was very planful. He was very
Okay.
planful in what he did. But that's sort of the point. They're
Okay.
so horrific, and they're in our TV, in our living room, night after night after night. We would respond.
Hold on, I'm going to cut it off there and ask our event, how much time do we have for the audience to ask questions to the panelists right now? About 10 minutes, okay. So I'd like to give anybody else who would like the mic. Go ahead.
The question I have is a point of clarification. With the mass shootings, and I'm not knowledgeable enough. By introduction, I'm Dr. David Bloom. I'm a radiologist here in town, and I don't know the facts. But my question is, in the mass shootings, are those routinely perpetrated by semi-automatic or automatic weapons as compared to a pistol where you have to reload after a short period of time and it doesn't fire in a rapid-fire sequence?
I think that each one is different. Some of them are done with semi-automatic rifles. Some of them are done with pistols. It depends on which one. Some of them are done with shotguns. It varies greatly.
Of the ones that have been mentioned, Aurora, Sandy Hook, and so forth, were those all by semi-automatic or automatic weapons? In other words, mass discharge of fire?
None of them were by automatic weapons.
Okay.
The misnomer of assault rifle, an assault rifle is a military weapon that is not available to the public. So calling an AR-15 an assault rifle is a misnomer. Okay.
What is the difference between an automatic weapon and a semi-automatic weapon?
An automatic weapon, you can empty a magazine with one pull of the trigger. A semi-automatic weapon fires one shot every time you pull the trigger. An AR-15 is not an automatic weapon. It's a semi-automatic rifle. You have to pull the trigger every time you want to shoot. With regard to Sandy Hook, he used an AR-15. With regard to Aurora, I believe he used a handgun of some sort. And with regard to what happened to Orlando, honestly, I can't recall.
And then the other question is you had just very quickly, I don't mean to take up too much time, but you had mentioned there would be really no restrictions on firearms of any kind, in your opinion. If you were going to go and purchase a semi-automatic weapon or a military-grade weapon, which you say that you have the right to do, what would you be buying it for? How would you use that gun? Is that for your protection purposes? I can't imagine you can carry that into Meyer easily
actually,
and so forth.
Theoretically, you could, but I wouldn't do it.
Okay.
I represented a guy a few years ago who was open carrying a rifle up and down South Woodward Avenue in downtown Birmingham. That was an interesting sight. The purpose of a modern sporting rifle, an AR-15, is self-defense. The courts have ruled that, yes, a 30-round magazine, it's a higher capacity magazine. That's referred to as a standard capacity magazine, not a high capacity magazine. And the courts have ruled that those weapons are uniquely suited to self-defense. In the home, or in the home primarily, obviously. You're not going to carry an AR-15 down the street, or else most people aren't. But it's primarily it's the best suited weapon for self-defense.
I'm a massive supporter of the US Constitution. I think it's an amazing document. And I've heard a lot of arguments for and against the Second Amendment. But I always thought it was interesting from the pro-gun stance, the idea of taking on the government in a time of tyranny. So I had a question, do you think it's realistic for armed citizens with AR-15s to take on the US military effectively? Because I don't think you could. Like, you got a Marine infantry unit in here, they'll clean everything up quick.
I don't think, no. Do I think it's realistic? No. But again, the founding fathers, the Federalist Papers made it very clear what their intent was behind the Second Amendment. It was to protect the First Amendment and the other rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights. Is it realistic these days that private individuals could take on a Marine regiment? Probably not. The counter argument there is perhaps the public should have better arms, the same arms as the military. Do I think that's realistic? No, I don't. Do I want to see that? No, I don't. But the restricting private firearms ownership is not going to make the public safe. And in times of tyranny, yeah, if it really came down to it, it could happen.
So, Mr. Makowski, you seem to indicate that the status quo is the best we can do.
No. No, I do not.
So when we argue, and I just so you know I'm a progressive liberal and a gun owner, and I believe in more restrictions on firearms. Because I am a good guy with a gun. I personally have no issue taking a class, like I took a hunter safety course, I took a firearm safety course. I believe that we should have laws that make just not being a responsible gun owner, but I think that it should be the law that I should be a responsible gun owner. That is to say, I shouldn't leave a loaded weapon in a car. I shouldn't leave a loaded weapon where my kids can get in the house. And I think that these things should be legally incumbent upon me. But what I'm hearing from you is that this is as good as we can do. When people from my, because I don't want to take anyone's guns and I don't want to give up my guns. And frankly, with the current political atmosphere, I get what the founding fathers are saying. Like, I'm not opposed to the concept of a well-regulated militia and an armed public. I get that. But the NRA and those to the right of the NRA approve the current administrative processes for the enforcement that you say that we need to do better. You're like, we just need to enforce as if the people who are tasked at the ATF with enforcing the laws from the fellow buying from Indiana and going to Chicago are just drinking coffee and eating donuts and don't give a crap about enforcement. So when you say we just need to enforce it, you're not talking about how they're only allowed to inspect if they think that somebody is an illegal firearms dealer, that they think that they're only allowed to inspect once a year, or the fact that we don't have a permanent director. We went without a permanent director of the ATF
Sir, can
for
we
like
get to a
7
question?
years.
Okay.
So my question is, what, because the devil's in the details when it comes to this enforcement that you talk about, as if the NRA has nothing to do with it. So what would you propose would be so much better besides it's just the crazy people? Because I'm talking about the woman who gets shot by her kid in Myers with the 2-year-old that pulls the gun out of the purse, because that is not responsible gun ownership. So I worked in Detroit for a long time. People would walk down the street with guns, and I didn't carry a gun because I didn't want to have to kill someone, because I didn't want that responsibility. But that gun was bought legally at some point, and then it was sold illegally at some other point. My question for you is, what can we do differently? If you're like, we need better enforcement, tell me what that means meaningfully, besides mental screening, because most gun violence is not committed by crazy people. Most gun violence is perpetrated by people, again, with guns that were originally bought legally.
What do you mean when you talk about better enforcement?
Okay, Dr. Brundage was very proud of the fact that we had 2.5 million sales of firearms denied by the National Criminal Background Check System. Right? Guess what? It's a felony to lie on the Form 4473, which is what you fill out when you go purchase a firearm. It's a felony to apply to purchase a firearm. Okay? So if I go to a gun store and I lie, or I try to purchase a firearm, and I fail a background check, I've committed a felony. Of those 2.5 million people who tried to obtain a firearm illegal, how many were prosecuted? 0. That's the problem. The problem is we have existing laws that are not enforced. Okay? With regard to mental illness, Dr. Brundage wants to restrict gun ownership to people who've been adjudicated mentally defective. That's not what the law says. The law says if you have a mental illness, you're not allowed to own firearms. Okay? It's even more restrictive. Okay? Enforcing the databases out there that track and kill this are woefully inadequate. Not their state participation is voluntary. If you have some states report mental health issues to FBI, some do not. Most states actually do not. So you've got it on the books. Track that data. Enforce the existing laws. There's no need to further restrict it because you're only restricting the rights of law-abiding citizens.
Dr. Brundage, I want to give you like 30 seconds to add whatever you have, and then we've got to open up.
I would just say I agree with, I'm not sure I know the numbers as well as he said, but I think we absolutely ought to prosecute those people who feloniously applied for a gun purchase. We ought to do that. Some states do, in fact, require the reporting of the adjudicated mentally ill, the felonies, and domestic violence. Michigan could, but we don't require that. It's encouraged. There's been extra funding to allow states to do that. We could, if we want to have more laws on the books, that would be a good thing, to prosecute people who shouldn't apply because they know they don't qualify and they're just trying to skate through the system. So that might be another point that we might agree that we ought to pursue those numbers.
And I do agree with that. If those people should already not be allowed to possess a firearm, they should not allowed to be making those purchases. So yeah, absolutely, prosecute them. That's the problem. We make all these feel-good laws, but we don't uphold them. We don't do anything to enforce. Get some enforcement.
Okay,
And she's
so
absolutely right with regard to the
So
mental health data.
we have some slender consensus there, and we'll
Absolutely.
stop there.